much for coming out at noontime today. I know it's a busy time in the semester, a busy time in the day, so thank you so much. We have with us Dr. Ariel Emmett. She's a writer, a visual journalist, a traveling scholar specializing in East Asia, science writing, and human interest. She is a recipient of a 2015 Fulbright grant to teach visual media and online journalism curriculum for universities in Indonesia. She received the U.S. Fulbright Scholar Award in 2018-19 to teach legal research and thesis writing at Strathmore University Law School in Nairobi. Emmett has also conducted a 10-month intensive study of the Chinese Belt and Road initiatives in Kenya and their impact on labor, human rights, and the economy. Dr. Emmett has been a professional journalist and teacher since beginning her career as a correspondent for Newsweek in the 1970s.
Oh.
Thank you for that.
Boy, that makes me feel really old. Okay.
Her articles have appeared in dozens of magazines and journals, including Boston Globe, Toronto Globe and Mail, Detroit Free Press, Philadelphia Inquirer, Ms., Omni, Parents, Saturday Review, Computer World, Visual Communication Quarterly, and American Journalism Review, among many others. Thank you so much,
Thank
Dr.
you.
Emmett, for joining
All right.
us this afternoon.
Thank you. I want to start out by asking how many of you have been to China or to Africa, and what do you know about it? Of course, we can't have a 45-minute discussion about what you know about it, but something. Anyone? This young man here?
I've been to China,
You've been to China? And what parts?
Chengdu and Beijing.
And were you studying there?
My dad used to work there, so I visited them.
Okay. And how was your experience?
I enjoyed it.
You enjoyed it? Do you speak any Chinese?
I don't.
Okay. That makes a difference. Okay. Anyone else been to China or Africa? Yes, of course. Dr. Stevens, right? Yeah, he's been there many times.
I've been to a number of places in China. I go way back to when Richard Nixon opened the place up.
Amazing. Ping pong diplomacy, right?
Right. And I'm still very much involved in Dalian. I'm the honorary director of a research center in Dalian right now.
I'm really happy that we still have some ties to China, because the political situation has become much more fraught, and China has been very aggressively moving into Africa. And today I'm going to tell you about my experiences over a 10-month period when I was on a Fulbright. I interviewed about 48 people. I was trying to count, four dozen or more. Everything from cleaning ladies to commercial counselors from China, lawyers. I was in a law school. I went to Masai Mara, which is this beautiful place here. I went to Amboseli. And I began to start to figure out a few things about this. Have you heard any complaints in the media about China incurring or creating debt traps in Africa? Has any of this come out? Yes. People who read about this stuff obviously know something about it. But I'm going to show you a few things. What I came up with was that China has a dose of overenthusiasm for lending. They have what I call a futuristic, kind of noble, long-term, fairly aggressive perspective. And in Kenya, what I found is that the majority of people there are living in the very short term. They're trying to survive. And there is an enormous gap between a very small group of very rich people in Kenya. These are the elites, mostly affiliated with government and a few industries. And there is a middle class, and an amazing technology revolution is happening in Kenya. The famous M-Pesa, I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but it's a financial system on your smartphones, which has completely revolutionized the way people spend money, buy goods, spend money. It's helped rural people move their goods to market. It's actually improved the GDP. There's a whole tech colony. There's now going to be a kind of Savannah Silicon based outside of Nairobi and in other places in Kenya. And the reason I think this is important is because what the Chinese did was they built two very large infrastructure projects, which I studied. One of them was the Standard Gauge Railroad. Anyone heard of that? It was an amazingly sophisticated railway that went from Mombasa, which is the southern port of Kenya on the Indian Ocean, to Nairobi, and then a second phase was built to Naivasha. And Naivasha is a very beautiful town north, a little bit northwest of Nairobi. There's only one problem: they stopped. They were going to build it to Uganda, to Juba in South Sudan, and to Ethiopia. And the Chinese felt that Kenya had borrowed and could not pay its debts. And so they stopped this project, which basically was going to interconnect almost all of East Africa together. And they are still scrambling now to find the Kenyans, the Ugandans, the Ethiopians, and Rwandans are scrambling to find a way to complete that infrastructure project so that goods can move from the north, Ethiopia, and Sudan. Oil. A lot of oil in Sudan. A lot of arguments about Sudan. South Sudan and Rwanda, which you know had a huge civil war a while back. But they're trying. But the Chinese have exhibited a kind of overenthusiasm, and the Kenyans have done something very different. Not only are they the elites under the former president, Uhuru Kenyatta. Uhuru Kenyatta was the son of the founder of independent Kenya, Jomo Kenyatta. And he is a very rich man, and he kind of forgot about the details of his contracts. He agreed to practically everything that the Chinese wanted, and it has resulted in some very bad press, but also some chaos. And now Kenya has one of the worst debt trap problems in Africa. So I want to show you a little bit about what I found. I found disconnects in a lot of things, not just in the infrastructure of the country, but in the communication styles of both Africa, Kenya, and China. I found differences in time perception, a very big difference in the cultural perception of China, in that the country was past thinking up until Mao, and then it reversed, and suddenly it talks about broad horizons, and led the Kenyans into this general feeling of, oh, you're going to pay it back. You're going to do exactly what we're going to do. You're going to build up your manufacturing. You're going to do your transport. We're going to move Africa into the 21st century. And the Kenyans are saying, we can't even pay our bills. And now we're raising taxes on ordinary people, and we've lowered social spending. Okay, so I'm going to go through how this happened and what actually happened to both the elites. Now, Kenya, does everybody know it was a British colony? Okay. Colonialism has a big impact in Kenya on the elites, who are the governing people. And they have not quite gotten rid of that. So let's go to the next slide, and I'll show you. Okay, this is Amboseli. It's a gorgeous national park. It has a view of Kilimanjaro. And I don't know if you've ever read Hemingway's The Snows of Kilimanjaro, but I got to see it at night at 10 o'clock when the clouds cleared. It was magnificent. And I took both my driver and his child there, and a friend of mine who now is a venture capital researcher in New York, and she's an attorney, a lovely girl. I've kind of semi-adopted her. But in these national parks, you have a sense of the old Kenya, of time standing still. But then something happens. Now the Chinese are in there, and they are moving fast. Okay, can we go to the next one? These are some of the people that I knew. This was my driver, Edward. And these are some of the very nice Chinese boys who are, they're engineering graduates who are building the Ngong Road outside of Nairobi. And here are some of the workers there who make about $60 a month in wages. They are only there to, quote, protect the Chinese and protect what's going on. They're not skilled. There is an enormous wage gap between what the Chinese will pay for their own labor and what they pay Kenyans. What we have here is the famous standard gauge railroad, which is what I studied. It is a larger gauge. It is 1435 centimeters in width, which is larger than the old British meter rail, which was built in Kenya in 1896. And there was a huge controversy in Kenya about, do we fix the meter rail, which will be much cheaper, or just do we go to the new standard, the new African standard? They also decided to build a diesel railroad instead of an electric railroad. Now, I'll tell you a little bit more about that. That is one of the terminals in Nairobi that I took the rail, and I got to interview all kinds of people, Chinese engineers. There was a Kenyan guy who was a wildlife poaching officer. He was there to try to catch poachers in the park. And he told me all about what happened to the national park and all of the animals who have had to change their migration patterns because of this railway going right through Nairobi National Park and further south, Tsavo National Park. And it has actually inhibited migrations every year. So there's been all kinds of environmental issues. And the other big project I studied was called LAPSET. Now what you're seeing here is kind of before development. LAPSET is going to be a brand new port. It stands for Lamu, Sudan, Lamu Port, Sudan. I don't know, there's a long thing. I'll look it up for you. But it is a master project to interconnect all of Africa together across the border, the equator. And it will start with oil pipelines, roads to northern Kenya, which is still very, very rural, a railroad link to the standard gauge railroad, highways, and there is a plan for 32 berths. Now, the Chinese did not lend money for this, but they got the contract to build it. And there have been some issues there too. Okay, let's move on. Okay, I want to play you a promotion from South China Morning Post on the opening of the standard gauge railroad. Just tremendous enthusiasm for this beautiful new railroad, nice cars, was going to supposedly send 22 million tons of cargo every year back and forth across the lines. It is only doing 8.7. It is only doing about a third of what they expected, and it's only doing 25% of the revenues that were projected by a Chinese feasibility study, which essentially lied. So we'll talk about that in a minute. The 1.5 billion is the second phase. The original was 3.28 billion. The total length of the SGR is 480 kilometers from Nairobi. That is Uhuru Kenyatta, the president, who was so thrilled to have done this deal with the Chinese. So this was the opening, the maiden trip. That's the Kenyan flag. Absolutely thrilled. Beautiful new infrastructure for the country.
As we are going from Mombasa to Nairobi, Nairobi to Naivasha, I think the economy of Kenya is improving bit by bit.
White elephant that will sink Kenya into debt. That's the critique, and there's some truth to that. The cost of moving cargo by train is double what it is by truck. So it has created an amazingly unequal deal for Kenyans. And they're trying to transport most of the stuff through trucks, not standard gauge railroad. What's happening there? 60 billion, over $1 trillion around the world. 60 billion in Africa for highways, ports, and railroads. The Belt and Road infrastructure projects, which really ramped up with Xi Jinping's rise to the leadership of China, is trying to put billions into stadiums, modern roads, the Thika Highway, dams that are desperately needed in Kenya, utilities, you name it, billions going to Kenya because it is considered the gateway to Africa from the east coast to the west. It's where China can ship its goods from the Indian Ocean all the way into well, now they're talking both Mombasa and Lamu. Lamu is a little bit north of Mombasa, but they're creating a new port. And they're going to use it to basically put a huge amount of stuff into China. There's already an enormous trade deficit. Kenya puts out, I think, 139 million a year in exports to China. China does 3.9 billion to Kenya. Okay, so we have a big, big discrepancy. Now, Mao Zedong, I studied Chinese for many years, so he had a commitment to underdeveloped countries. He called it Han, Fei La, which means China. Fei is Feijiu, which is Africa, and La, which is Latin America. And he had a commitment to try to do something for these countries, when really China wasn't doing very well itself, but he wanted to do it, to unite basically non-Western countries to join with China to a new world order. And many people argue today China is getting to be a leader in the new world order. Okay, the Kenyan poverty rate, when I wrote my first chapter on this, which is going to appear in a book this month from Edward Elgar, I'll show you the reference later, the poverty rate was a third when it was reported to be a third around 2018-19. It is now reported to have dropped. But we're talking about $1.90 a day defining poverty. That means if you make $2.50 a day, you're not in that class. And what I saw in Kenya was enormous discrepancy between the affluent, who are incredibly brilliant and well-educated. Many of them go abroad. They speak excellent English. And the people in the countryside and in the slums. Nairobi has 7 slums that were not there in the 1960s. Okay, so there's a whole other thing going on there that I can talk about. It's called corruption. All right, next one. All right, this was my dean. He's such a cool guy. Luis Franceschi. He's from Venezuela. He asked me to come to teach research methods in Strathmore University. Now, his assessment of what was wrong with the country: shallow public discourse, low ethical standards and trust, deficient accountability, and yet amazing innovation. I mean, Kenya is a happening place in terms of the cities. You can go to tech startups. You can go work for tech startups. If you're interested in doing an internship abroad, you should talk to me afterward about helping the Kenyan, not just the government, but private. This is a democracy now. So a lot of the progress in Kenya is coming from private sources, not from the state. Okay, so go on. All right, so I distilled everything down for you because, again, we're on a time thing. Basically, I saw a disconnect in time perception, and then I started to research what that meant, both culturally and in terms of the communication styles. Okay, China, they promise prosperity. They have a hyper-eagerness to enter new markets. Now they're pulling back in Africa because they are not doing well. China's GDP has gone down. They're having a population problem. They have 21% unemployment among young people. China has changed a lot since 2019. So what they were willing to do a few years ago, they are not willing to do now. They are pulling back. I would call it reckless futurism. The Kenyans will call it a debt trap reputation. I think there's some evidence of that. They do things like they loan above the London Interbank Offering Rate. To build the railroads, they loaned Kenya $3.6 billion at a rate of either 3%, there were separate loans, 3.6 above the standard international offering rate for loans from banks. Now, you want to help a country that's not doing well? Why would you do that? Why would you insist? Why would you insist that you would need your own labor, that no one could compete for a bid, that there were no tenders, that everything was controlled by China, and that the port and the railroad would be run by China until at least 2027 when Kenya was supposed to start paying back the loans. This is the first year they're really paying them back. Okay, 2021, they started servicing. Now they're up to $850 million just servicing these loans. Okay, so there is another interesting thing I learned from an African researcher is that China completely misunderstood the land system in Kenya. They tried to import their sense of central control. In China, they have a bilateral system of ownership. The urban ownership is all run by the government. Rural, there's some private ownership, but mostly towns report to the party. It is much easier in China to control land acquisition. They didn't anticipate that with the standard gauge railroad. What did happen? Huge cost overruns, lawsuits from private citizens, federal ministries competing with county municipalities, competing with tribes, competing with private ownership, all screaming about, you're not paying us enough, and talking to the Kenyan government about land grabs that they did not pay for. And still, this has not been resolved. So that was a strategic mistake from China, is they tried to grab land in anticipating that it would be a fairly easy thing to do because the national government of Kenya could do it for them. And the answer was they couldn't. And so Kenya's got a very, very strong legal system. They changed the constitution in 2010 to something called devolution. And devolution is an interesting concept, but what it basically means is they wanted to devolve the central government authority to the towns, to give people the chance to govern themselves rather than one central authority. And this has become a huge disconnect between the central government and its ambitions to do what I call big cigar projects. Yay, you know, we've got this great railroad, vote for me, and the towns and the rural people who are still, in many respects, starving. I mean, there is a strange kind of disconnect between that philosophy of colonial administration versus decentralized control, all right? So Kenya has that problem, and China misunderstood it. They need PR. Oh my God, if you could go work for Chinese government as a public relations or journalist, you would be in clover because they don't know how to communicate their needs. They keep very quiet when they have problems like, you know, riots, fights. They try not to publicize it in the media at all. It's the Kenyan press that publicizes all this stuff. Okay, Kenya still has a fairly open media. Now, what's Kenya's problems? They definitely need infrastructure. They need tech innovation. There's fighting between that colonial tradition of central control and devolution, this idea that the counties, the towns, the people should be voting and deciding things, not just President Uhuru Kenyatta and his group. They do a spending, Kenyatta's spending spree is phenomenal. And I'm going to read to you something about that. Does everybody want to hear this? Okay, because it's amazing. This is from an economist named David Ndii, who is the most brilliant public intellectual I have ever met in Africa. And this is what he said. Incidentally, there are 40,000 Kenyans were in Nairobi and other parts of Kenya by 2019. Public debt has tripled in 5 years, said economist David Ndii, who completed an audit of the Kenyatta administration budgets between 2013 and 2018. He continued, the government has borrowed 2.5 trillion Kenyan shillings in the last 5 years. In today's value, that's about $16.8 billion. They have borrowed it not only from domestic sources, but from Eurobonds, sovereign bonds, purchased in London, and when Uhuru Kenyatta took over, we had no commercial debt at all, zero. Though the Chinese railroad accounted for less than $4 billion, the rest has been taken up in public projects and deposits in overseas banks that can't be accounted for. How much of the 2.5 trillion Kenyan shillings can we see on the ground? It can't be more than half. Ndii cites government projects like missing dams. For example, they got a Eurobond for 6,800 kilometers of utilities, of which electric transmission lines, of which only 2,800 were built. They don't know where the money has gone. This has been a very corrupt country from the beginning, but this Kenyatta stuff is completely off the charts. Okay, so this corruption thing, combined with miscommunication, combined with different time perception of risk and reward, has caused this weird disconnect in Kenya, which is very interesting, but sad for, I think, the Kenyans, the people I met in the slums, the people I met in the rural towns. Okay, can we go on? They don't like the World Bank either. Why? And I'll tell you. Okay, this is David Ndii. He's going to talk to you a little bit for just a couple of minutes about the source of corruption in Kenya, the source of colonialism versus devolution.
Essentially, you know, in Kenya, the government of Kenya was established as a colonial administration. So we call it colonial administration. So it is an administrative state. The colonials did not establish a political system for people to govern themselves.
Yeah.
They established a system to administer the colony, so in which they could administer and manage us and control the Africans in the colony and exploit it and do all manner of things. So at independence, we wanted to establish a political system because people govern themselves through a political system. So we asked ourselves, what kind of political system should we have? And the debate then was that we should go back to people, the different communities governing themselves, and then forming a nation state called federalism, Majimbo. And we formed that in the independence constitution. But there was already an established administrative class, which then formed a national elite. Okay? And that elite was wedded to managing an administrative state. Yeah? So the battle for Kenya has always been between this original administrative class, which transformed into the national political elite, which believes it is the one which should govern the country from the center. They are the ones who are left to be governing us.
Yeah.
And the people at the bottom who believe that we should govern ourselves and constitute a new nation. Okay? So they then disbanded the independence constitution and restored the administrative state. Because the one-party state was really a restoration and maintenance of the administrative state. So that is what we call a status quo. That is the establishment, the center, which believes that it is their right to govern this country from the center and to govern everybody. And to whatever. The constitution was a battle about that. And we went back and said, no, we want a nation where we govern ourselves from the bottom.
Okay, so again, that tension is between people who expected, after the 2010 Constitution of Kenya, to have much more of a say in what the government did than what has actually happened. Uhuru Kenyatta has been followed by William Ruto. There are 46 tribes in Kenya, incidentally. Kenyatta is a Kikuyu, which is the majority. Okay, you might have heard that. Has anyone seen the film Out of Africa? Okay, Karen Blixen used to talk about my Kikuyu, meaning her servants, that she liked, and she wanted to save their tribal lands. But the guy who is now succeeding Uhuru Kenyatta is named William Ruto, and Ruto is a Kalenjin. It's a different tribe, and he has somewhat different agendas, although he is also a very rich businessman, and he doesn't seem to care at all about helping people in the slums, doing rural stuff. He's inherited the debt trap that has been created in Kenya, the Eurobonds, which are coming due in 2024, and the Chinese loans. He has inherited a real mess. And this is what he's spending his money on. And the only answer so far is raise taxes on average people who are actually working and cutting spending for social services. That's what they've done. The manufacturing actually has gone from almost 12% of the GDP down to 8%. This was exactly the opposite of what they were promising with this project. All right? So this is SGR. It was a 480-kilometer, I'm supposed to stay here for the camera. You can see the original Mombasa. It's a very Arabic, Portuguese place. It's a very interesting, beautiful place. Tremendous amount of Muslim influence there. And it was supposed to go up to Nairobi, Naivasha, and then it was going to go to Malaba in the middle of the country, and then up to Juba in Sudan, and Kigali in Rwanda, and it also, well, there's also a link to Ethiopia in the other project we're going to talk about, LAPSET. But basically, one of the commentators who is a corruption guru in Kenya said this is the jewel in the crown of corruption in Kenya, that they really don't know where all this money is because the government will not release a full audit of how that money was spent. And the SGR, interestingly, cost 3 times the international standard and 4 times the original estimate. The comparable railway the Chinese built in Ethiopia to Addis Ababa was electric, and it cost 3 times less than what it cost in Kenya. Now, the Kenyan officials have said, and this is true, that the landscape of Kenya is very challenging. It's got a lot of mountains. It's got a lot of other stuff that was more difficult. But the land ownership problem in Kenya has raised the prices tremendously. Okay, so they loaned, well, I've seen different numbers, 3.28, 3.6, 3.8 billion, and then another 1.5 billion for the second phase in the Great Rift Valley, which I also visited. And it stopped. Chinese wouldn't do it anymore. They're afraid they're not going to get their money back. Period, end of story. And nothing has happened. The Kenyans have also complained that there is a lack of contract transparency, and that there have been fears that have been instituted both by the media and by the Auditor General's report that the port of Mombasa is actually collateral, that the Chinese, that they gave up sovereign immunity in Mombasa to secure the loans from China, which means that if China doesn't get paid back, they will continue to operate Mombasa, but technically not to own it. And I will tell you a little bit more about that. But it is called take or pay. It's a very interesting Chinese concept. I'll tell you a little bit more about that as we go. Go ahead. Now, this is the second project. It's called LAPSET. I've got to find, I can't remember the name. It's Lamu, South Sudan Port, whatever it stands for. Anyway, it's supposed to link Ethiopia, Kenya, South Sudan together. It is $25 billion. Only 3 berths have been built so far. They're scrambling to find money because most of the international partners who committed to this project have pulled out, including China, Brazil, Japan, and several others. I have the list in my paper if any of you want to read it. Okay, can you want to hit that?
Ethiopia, Kenya, and South Sudan have recently reaffirmed their adherence to moving forward with the LAPSET Corridor program, a massive $25 billion infrastructure project in East Africa. The Lamu Port South Sudan-Ethiopia Transport Corridor program, which begins in Lamu, Kenya, remains the region's largest and most ambitious infrastructure project, uniting the 3 countries together with essential infrastructural projects such as ports, highways, railways, an oil pipeline, and airports.
And recreation centers and tech centers, a lot of stuff. This, incidentally, I think is a chatbot
In a
talking.
recent
I don't
meeting
think
for
it's
the
a real human
project,
being.
Ethiopian Transport Minister Dagmawit Moges maintained that Africa's top priority towards continental integration relied on consistent provision of infrastructure, further indicating the coming together of the African states and leaders towards achieving the goal. According to the minister, because Ethiopia, Kenya, and South Sudan share a common goal of achieving economic growth and prosperity, closing the infrastructure gap should be a priority for all three countries, emphasizing this to be accomplished through regional cooperation and determined action.
As you can see, there's a lot of Kenya that's very
The
beautiful.
$25 billion infrastructure Lapsed Corridor project, which will link Kenya with Ethiopia, Uganda, and South Sudan, has its headquarters in Magogoni in Kenya's historic coastal town of Lamu. The far-reaching project involves a railway, a highway, a crude oil pipeline and a fiber optic cable connecting the four countries. The project will also include several airports, resort cities, an oil refinery, a 32-berth port in Lamu, and other supporting infrastructure mini-projects. Adan Mohammed, Kenya's Cabinet Secretary for East African Community and Regional Development, stated in the recent meeting that Africa faces challenges such as youth unemployment, low intra-African trade and industrialization, and inefficient agriculture. He also revealed that the other major issue, and the reason for the recent meeting, is the poor infrastructure that connects the African continent, and it is for this reason that they believe LAPSIT and similar programs will play a critical role in reversing the challenges that Africa faces today.
Okay, as you can see, a lot of fancy buildings still in Kenya now, and the southern port of Lamu is still very, very much like the original whitewashed. It has this kind of Arabic feel to it. There are people there who speak Arabic. The Portuguese were there. It has a very different feel. So what does LAPSIT? Okay, here is the master plan is to link the railroads, the highways, the ports right across Africa from east to west. Okay, and then the other railways will interconnect. And so that's, now in Kenya itself, Lamu, as you can see, is also on the Indian Ocean, but it is north of Mombasa by about 200 kilometers. And it goes to a central city called Isiolo, then it goes to Nairobi, and it is going to do what the Chinese refused to do, build that third phase. So it's going to go up, in theory, to Ethiopia and connect to the Addis Ababa Railway and go to Juba in South Sudan. And this is, in theory, going to help agricultural people ship their goods less expensively, we hope. Okay, right now it's dirt roads, gravel, pits. There are a couple of major highways in Kenya, but it's still a big challenge to get to Turkana in the north, which has oil reserves, and Marsabit, where my adopted daughter, Grace, is from. Okay, keep going, thank you. Okay, so this, some people characterize this as China's new Silk Road, but they are not investing in this, which is interesting. They have basically cornered the market on all contracting in Kenya. We are not doing it. We're giving money to organizations and NGOs. I have lots of links and papers about what America is doing, but we are not a present tense contractor. What the central government wanted to do was deal with one source, Beijing, and come up with their grand master plan, and they don't want to mess. Now, China has these things called state-owned companies. Okay, China Road and Bridge was a state-owned company that built the standard gauge railroad. China Communications Construction Company is building Lamu. However, they were attacked by al-Shabaab terrorists a few years ago, and they cleared out. So it's not clear whether they're going to continue. The Chinese don't like to fight, okay? They don't like to put themselves in any kind of vulnerable position. So it's not clear to me who's going to build the rest if they get the money. Okay, going on. This was on the boat I took. Okay, this is my image of what Lamu looks like. The problems with Lamu, they have beautiful mangrove forests there. they rely on fishing. And all these port problems have created lots of citizen pushback. The Kenyans are very ecologically minded. They stopped a coal-fired plant the Chinese wanted to build in Lambu for power. They're fighting, there are citizens groups fighting for the mangrove forests, and there are citizens groups fighting for land ownership, because once again, accusing the government of taking land without compensating. I'm talking about Kenyan government taking land without compensating private citizens who own it, and tribes. Okay, keep going. This gives you an idea of the architecture. It's very beautiful. It's a very small area. This is going out to the Indian Ocean. Okay, go on. All right, now what I did in this study was I interviewed about 4 dozen people, at least. I went to conferences, trade shows. That's Dr. Guozi, who is the top, he was, I don't think he's there anymore, the top commercial counselor of China, and he spoke very eloquently about China's plans. He was not concerned about the debt trap at all. He thinks we'll either forgive the loans, we'll renegotiate them, we are not going to own the Port of Mombasa. He also told me he made a phone call to one of his operatives at the Standard Gauge Railroad, and I said, look, this thing is only traveling, there are trains only going 8 times a day. He said, not right, there are 20. And he called up this guy and he reported that there were 20. 20 trains going back and forth from Nairobi to Mombasa to pick up or drop off cargo. But as it turns out, it's a lot less than that. Okay, basically, it's a third. They wanted to do 22 million tons a year. They're down to 8.7. They owe $200 million a year in losses on this standard gauge railroad. The Kenyans love it because it has reduced the time to get to Mombasa from 22 hours on the British rail system to 5. It's very, very efficient that way. The problem is the cargo fees, taxes are much more expensive than trucks. And Uhuru Kenyatta got so mad at one point that he actually outlawed trucks. And he promised the Chinese a certain amount of cargo traffic as part of his deal. And it turns out Ruto has just reversed that decision. Anyway, Dr. Guozi told me a lot of stuff. Those were some of my brilliant students. That's Claude Kamau. And this was my first day in Nairobi, where I dealt with a very smart Kenyan surveyor who was working with the Chinese. Now, the interesting thing is that the Chinese, the young people who are in Kenya are generally very easy to work with, and they like the Kenyans. The older Chinese have a very, I want to say in Chinese, 瞧不起. They look down on the Kenyans for their color, for their lack of expertise, or what they perceive. The biggest problem is angry older people who have been exported from China to oversee these projects. All right, go on. Okay, so what were my research questions? All right, technically, I was doing Fulbright research. I asked people, do you think the Chinese involvement in SGR and LAPSET has been successful? What are the advantages and shortcomings? Has it improved quality of life? I really cared about the labor situation in Kenya. I talked to cleaning ladies in new shopping malls who were making nothing, not a living wage from the Chinese. Is there a difference in time perspective affecting Chinese and Kenyan assessments of risk and reward? Yes, there is. Does economic disparity, poor wages, and lack of government transparency produce negative perceptions of China and the Chinese projects? Yes, it does. Can we go on? Okay, so what I wanted to tell you a little bit about, theoretically, are you studying theory? Anybody studying theory in communication here? No? Yes? Not much? A little bit of theory? Okay, I'll give you a real short description of...
You're in theory. You've had theory.
Okay, basically, there was a scholar named Medeiros who claimed, very interestingly, he cited Max Weber, the economist and sociologist, that cultural time perception is directly related to economic performance, and that the time perspectives affect everything in a culture. productivity, business decisions, PR decisions, time and emotions related about time. All of this is affected. Now, these other guys, Levesque and Stefan and Zimbardo and Boyd, they all cited each other. They came up with 5 different frames. One was the future time perspective, delay gratification to get to long-term goals. The Germans are great at that. So are the Chinese. The hedonistic time perspective is, hey, let's be retired. Let's enjoy it here and now. We may not have much time, right? Present fatalistic. Endure the present without being able to change it. That's the story of a lot of Kenyans who have been ripped off. Past positive time perspective is draw strength from past experience. You know, in China, they love to quote, you know, their ancestors and Confucius, and I mean, they don't do it as much now, but there is a huge tradition in China of 5,000 years of history, of culture. That's a big, big plus. Now, past negative time experiences, oh, we blew it. Okay, so how does that work out in my study? How are we doing on time? Okay, I got about 12 minutes. Keep going. So, I love this quote. It's from Graham Peck, who was an American journalist in China in the 40s, and he watched the war with the Japanese, and he watched the civil war between the Chinese nationalists and the Chinese communists right after 1949. And he said, at the time, by one view of time, the future is behind you, above you. The past is before you, below you, where you can examine it. Man's position in time is that of a person sitting beside a river, facing always downstream as he watches the river flow past. Well, I couldn't find a guy just sitting there watching downstream, but basically this guy is moving toward, he's watching the past, the future is behind him in the mountains somewhere. You can't see it. Okay, that was the original Chinese perspective. Let's move on. You may not agree with that, but this is what happened, okay? The Japanese invaded China in the 30s. It was terrible. They changed the name of the country. Well, they first went to Manchuria, where I actually went. They called it Manchukuo, and that's a Japanese plane bombing Chongqing, which you've been to, right? Chongqing, Chongqing. Didn't you say you went to Chongqing?
Chengdu.
Oh, Chengdu. It's very close, okay. Then there was a civil war between the Maoists, the communists, and the nationalists led by Chiang Kai-shek. And Peck said people were in shock. And they said it began to seem that everyone alive was locked in a sort of plane or rocket embarked on a swift trajectory into the future. And between that and Mao's calls to unite the country, get rid of the corrupt nationalists, 我们要起来了. We want to go rise up. And you hear that all the time now in China. Suddenly they became future-oriented. I'm not saying they don't look at the past, but in terms of industrial time clocks, in terms of expectations of hard work, the Chinese have become very future-oriented. Okay, go on. Now, the Africans. This is a very interesting philosopher, and if you're ever interested in Kenya and African philosophy, I think you should look at his work. African tribal culture is rooted in the past. The linear concept of time, with an indefinite past, a present, and an infinite future, is practically foreign to African thinking, tribal thinking, okay? The future is virtually absent because the events which lie in it have not taken place, and they have not been constituted and cannot therefore constitute time. That was his view in 1969. And that's interesting because it's very similar to what the Chinese felt before the revolution. They were past-oriented and present-oriented, not future-oriented. Okay, now keep going. Now, this young woman is my adopted daughter, Grace Dide, who is a lawyer, and she's now a venture capitalist. And she didn't think Mbiti was quite right. She told me she's younger. She said that the future is real, tangible, and achievable for African homes when property can be passed to future generations. So land in Kenya is a measure of the future. And if you violate that land, you cause problems, okay? So land is ancestral links. Land is viewed from our colonial background. British took it from us. We're mad at them. It's a touchy subject, and the focal point of that new devolution constitution was we want lands to be protected and we want Kenyans to own them, not foreigners. Okay? That's been the cause of some of the problems. Keep going. Okay, so what were my results? I would say that I think that China's building of the SGR was a measure of progress. You have to have a country with some infrastructure. You cannot just go with what you had. Particularly the meter rail is defunct. It isn't any good. So from that perspective, the Chinese said, this is necessary for your growth. My friend Zhengli Huang said to me, there are not enough dark lines across Africa, and what she meant by that, not enough roads, not enough trains, not enough stuff interconnecting the countries. The debt problems, they believe, will be solved because they had to do it in the 70s and 80s. They were running into all kinds of problems with debt, borrowing from other international players while they were building up their industry. And what happened? Now they have the most powerful industry in the world. So they paid their debts. So they expect that Africa will too. China misunderstood, as I said, that patchwork of competing land claims. It caused a lot of problems on SGR. Now, there's a take or pay option here, which I don't know how much you want to know about this, but the Kenyans are under the impression that if they don't pay back their loans to China, China is going to own Mombasa Port. They use it as collateral. It turns out that's not quite the case. It turns out that what take or pay means is that you secure a loan with something tangible like a port. But what it means is you use the port's operating income as a way to pay back the debt. So that the Chinese basically take both this SGR and the Mombasa money that they get from the port and the cargo and use it to pay back some of their debt. And the theory is that they will not own the port per se, but they are running the port along with some Kenyan officials. And eventually they will renegotiate the loans if the Kenyans can't pay for them. So it's very subtle, but most Kenyans believe that the Chinese are taking over Mombasa Port, and they're very upset, okay? And the reason they did that is because there were some media reports and misinterpretations of take or pay. I checked this with Zhengli Huang. I don't know, does anyone want to hear what she had to say, or shall I just skip over it? It's not what? I can tell you later. Yeah, time. All right, so what has happened here? Huge amount of public debt. 64% of Kenya's bilateral debt is Chinese, but only 17% of the total. That means they owe everybody. They owe the World Bank, they owe the IMF, they owe Britain and the Eurobonds. They owe so much money, it's staggering. They admire the Chinese get it done, hard work, but many claim debt imperialism, racism. There have been incidents, and non-competitive contracts. They were most angry because the Kenyatta administration didn't go out for competitive bids. They just agreed, you give me the money, we'll build you the railroad, we set the terms. That's what China said, they went for it. SGR won't pay for itself without huge government subsidies, higher taxes, lower spending, and that is exactly what is happening. The amount of money that is being spent for other things in Kenya, healthcare, education, jobs, way down. Okay, and the manufacturing has actually gone down, not up. And that's also happened in Ghana, too, when they built a road. So infrastructure is not the answer to everything, a country's social problems. It is only one little piece, and there isn't a balance. Okay, go on. Look, we're almost done here. Okay, so Lapset's too early to tell. We don't know what's going to happen there. We know that Ethiopia and Kenya have announced plans for this railway link. They're going to try to build. It's up in the air. I think it will take much longer than they originally suspected. Okay, so we're almost out of time, so questions? Oh, can you go to the last page? That's the book that I've written a chapter in. It's all about this, and thank you very much for coming. If you have questions, I'm here.
They have to get to practice.
Okay.
That's why they're going. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so why should you care as communication students? That's an interesting question. All right. Can anybody answer that? because there are opportunities in Africa for you everywhere. And I'm going to give Sonia a PowerPoint presentation I did analyzing how to get a Fulbright grant. If you want to go over there and work, you want to intern, it is a gorgeous country. The people are lovely, and they don't pay as much attention to the Chinese anymore. Okay? All right, so that's it. Any other questions? We're done?
Any questions?
What got you interested in this topic?
Well, when I was young, I became very interested in China, because back then, we were talking about the Cultural Revolution. That was 1966 to 76. It was a terrible time. But my professors at University of Michigan really talked it up. They said, this is the future. Once we get rid of this Cultural Revolution nightmare, China's going to come up. And in 1989, you know that Deng Xiaoping, who was then the head of China, basically opened up the economy. And that's when they went through the roof. And I had already studied Chinese. I lived in Taiwan. And if you want to have a discussion about what's going to happen with China and Taiwan, I'd be happy to do that. But I was drawn to it. That's the best way I could describe it. I went to Indonesia to teach. I've taught in Hong Kong, Beijing, Indonesia, and Africa, and Ireland in my career. And I just became enamored of wanting to know, because I started to read about, the Belt and Road, and they're going to take over 60 countries, and Xi Jinping is going to take over the world, and all this other crap. And I just kind of wanted to see for myself what it was like. And I had a Kenyan student living in my house while I was getting my doctorate, and he encouraged me to apply to Strathmore University, the law school. I became friendly with the dean. So that's how it happened. You can do it too. And what I want to say to you is thank you for coming, because I don't think we have enough Americans who are interested and understand how much Africa is going to count in the next 50 years. And we should be there more. We're not. We're not there. Our investments, I have a whole list of links you can read about American. We give them tons of money as AID. We give them tons of money in grants. We give NGOs, and they waste money like crazy. But to build that infrastructure and get that country into middle income status, which is what Uhuru Kenyatta wanted by 2030, he was called the Vision 2030, is not going to happen thanks to this debt stuff. And I think it's a really good lesson for developing countries to be much more careful about negotiating contracts and loans from the international banking system. Anything else? Yes.
Yeah, and this is a tough question. It takes 2 hours to answer, but just give me a few lines. So what is the future of China in Africa?
I think what do you think? I think it's very significant.
Yeah, I do very much. I second your point. It is painful to see us, the United States, not being much more involved in Africa than we are.
Right. And in the previous administration before Biden, basically it was all America first. So we weren't supposed to be interested in anybody else, which is baloney as far as I'm concerned. We need to be interested. We need to care. We need to be there. And as I said, you will never forget, if you get a chance to go, you will never forget that country. It's a fascinating country, and it's moving very, very fast. It has a British tradition, which is good in some ways because they have the English language and you can learn Swahili, but it's a very interesting country. But yes, I do think China, if Xi Jinping can figure out a way to start employing its young people, he will go back into China, into Africa in a big way. Most likely Africa. Latin America, maybe, some, but Africa is closer. He can move his goods through the Indian Ocean right into the continent and get raw materials and oil and all that other stuff. Okay? Thank you. I appreciate it. And if you want to know about how everybody lied to each other during the contract negotiations, I have a whole list of things.